I kept the ring on for 11 months after he told me he wanted a divorce. Not because I was holding on. I want to be clear about that. I kept it on because I didn't know what to do with my hands. We had been married for 31 years. You don't just take a ring off after 31 years and know where to put it. You don't know what your left hand is supposed to look like without it. My husband's name was Gordon. He was 73 years old when he sat down across from me at the kitchen table. The same table where we had eaten maybe 12,000 meals together, where I had helped his daughter from his first marriage with her college applications, where we had opened the envelope that told us our retirement accounts had finally crossed the number we'd been chasing for 2 decades, and he told me he had consulted an attorney. I thought someone had died. I thought he was going to tell me he had cancer. He had that look. The one where a person has rehearsed something so many times that when they finally say it, it doesn't sound like them anymore. He said he had been unhappy for a long time. I said, "Unhappy how?" He said he didn't want to get into it. I was 67 years old. I had a bad hip that I'd been putting off surgery on because we were supposed to go to Portugal in the spring, and I didn't want to spend the trip in a compression stocking. I had 3 grandchildren I picked up from school on Tuesdays and Thursdays. I had a garden that had taken me 8 years to get right, with the roses finally coming in the way I'd always wanted along the back fence. I had a life, a whole, complete, specific life, and he didn't want to get into it. Gordon had been a structural engineer before he retired. He was methodical about everything. The way he loaded the dishwasher, the way he planned road trips with printed backup routes in case of traffic. When we first got together, I found it endearing. Later, I found it exhausting. By the end, I think I had just stopped noticing. What I didn't know, what I had no reason to suspect, was that the methodical part of him had been quietly working for the past 2 years on something I would not discover until I had an attorney of my own. Our home in Asheville, North Carolina, was worth approximately $2.8 million. We had bought it in 2004 for considerably less, in the kind of neighborhood that people my age sometimes stumble into before anyone else realizes what it's going to become. We had renovated it slowly, over years, the way you do when a house is also a project and a marriage and a retirement plan all at once. Gordon had handled the finances. I want to say that plainly because when I've told this story to people since, there's always a moment where someone says something like, "Well, you should have been more involved." And maybe that's true, but I also want to say that I ran the household, managed our calendar, organized every trip we ever took, coordinated care when both of his parents were dying in the same 18-month stretch, and maintained every single relationship we had as a couple, because Gordon was not someone who remembered birthdays or called people back. We had divided things. That is what you do in a marriage. You divide things and you trust. He had trusted me with a great deal. I had trusted him with the money, our children. Gordon had a daughter, Renata, from his first marriage, and we had 2 sons together, Miles and Joel. Did not react the way I expected. I expected them to be shocked. I expected them to be sad. I expected, if I'm being honest, for them to be on my side in the way that children usually side with the parent who has been more present, more reliable, the one who showed up. Miles called me 2 days after Gordon told me. He said he thought I needed to be realistic about what the process was going to look like. I didn't understand what he meant. He said that Dad had talked to him. He said the word dad the way you say it when the person you're talking to is not the parent you're thinking of. Joel didn't call at all for 6 weeks. Renata sent me a card, a sympathy card, the kind you send when someone dies. Inside she had written, "I'm sorry this is happening. I don't want to be in the middle of it," which I understood in theory. She was Gordon's daughter first, but I had known her since she was 19. I put the card in the kitchen drawer and I didn't touch it for a long time. The attorney Gordon had consulted was someone he had apparently been speaking to for the better part of a year. The divorce filing came 4 weeks after our kitchen table conversation. It was dense and formal and full of language I didn't recognize, and there was one paragraph near the back that I read 3 times before I understood what I was looking at. The house was listed as an asset held by something called Ridgeline Property Holdings, LLC. I called my sister Gloria in Raleigh. Gloria is 5 years younger than me and has always been the sharper one in practical matters. I read her the paragraph over the phone. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "When did he form that LLC?" I said I didn't know. She said, "Find out. I had spent 22 years as a high school English teacher before I retired. I am not, by nature, someone who panics. I have stood in front of rooms full of teenagers who did not want to be there, and I have held my ground. I know how to be still when things are difficult." But that night, after I got off the phone with Gloria, I sat in the garden for a very long time. It was October. The roses were finished for the year. Everything had been cut back and the beds were covered in the way Gordon usually did, but hadn't done this year. And I thought about how I had done it myself in September and hadn't thought anything of it. I had just done it because it needed to be done. That felt like a metaphor for something I wasn't ready to look at yet. I found an attorney named Patricia Walsh at a firm in Asheville that a woman in my book club had used 3 years earlier during her own divorce. Book club is how women my age survive most things, as it turns out. Patricia was thorough and direct, and in our first meeting she asked me questions for 90 minutes and took notes in a legal pad with a mechanical pencil. At the end, she set the pencil down and said, "I want to talk about this LLC." The LLC, she explained, had been formed 18 months before Gordon handed me divorce papers. He had transferred the deed on our home into it. On paper, this meant the house was no longer a marital asset. It was a business asset, held by an entity he controlled. It was, she said, one of the more common ways that financially savvy people attempt to shelter assets before a divorce. It was also, she said, something the courts in North Carolina did not look favorably upon when it could be demonstrated that the transfer was made in anticipation of the divorce rather than for a legitimate business purpose. She asked me if I had any reason to believe Gordon had been planning to leave me for longer than he'd let on. I thought about a lot of things in that moment. I thought about the trip to Portugal that kept getting postponed. I thought about the fact that Gordon had stopped coming to my book club dinners, even the ones where spouses were invited, about 2 years ago, and I had told myself it was because he was tired, or introverted, or simply not interested, all of which had always been true. I thought about a weekend the previous spring where he had told me he was visiting an old colleague in Charlotte and had come home quieter than he left. I said, possibly longer than I'd let on to myself. Patricia wrote something down. Discovery is a word that sounds almost gentle, like finding something, like coming across a forgotten photograph or a $20 bill in a coat pocket. What it actually means is that you sit across from your husband's attorney in a conference room and watch someone hand over documents you had no idea existed. Gordon had formed the LLC with the help of a financial advisor whose name I did not recognize, someone he had engaged separately from our joint financial planner. He had also moved a substantial amount from a personal investment account, one that was technically in his name only from before our marriage, that had grown significantly during our years together. Patricia had warned me about this account. She said proving I had contributed to its growth through supporting his career, managing our household, enabling his professional stability was possible but would require time and documentation. I said, "How much time?" She said, "Let's focus on the house first." The house case, it turned out, hinged on one thing. Gordon's attorney argued that Ridgeline Property Holdings had been formed for legitimate estate planning purposes and that the transfer predated any intent to divorce. Patricia requested the communications between Gordon and the LLC's formation attorney. In those communications, emails, mostly plain and businesslike and completely without feeling, there were references to what Gordon called restructuring for the next chapter. One email, sent 22 months before he filed, said that he wanted to ensure certain assets were clearly defined and protected in the event of a change in personal circumstances. Patricia showed me that email on a Tuesday afternoon. She had printed it out and highlighted two phrases. I read it twice. I said, he planned this for nearly 2 years. She said, that's what the timeline suggests, yes. I asked her if this changed what we could do. She said it changed quite a lot, actually. Gordon's health had not been good that year. He had a heart condition that had been managed with medication for several years, and sometime in the spring, while our attorneys were still exchanging documents, while I was still sleeping in the house that was technically no longer mine on paper, he had a significant cardiac event. Not fatal, but serious. Miles called me when it happened. I was surprised he called me. He said, Dad's in the hospital. He said it the way you say something when you're not sure whether you're supposed to be saying it. I said I was sorry to hear that. I meant it. I did not go to the hospital. I spent a long time deciding whether that made me a bad person, and I concluded that it did not. We were in the middle of a legal dispute over our home. I was not his wife in any practical sense anymore. I was, at that point, someone who used to know him better than anyone and was now learning how little I had actually known. Joel called me in April. It had been almost 5 months since we'd spoken properly. He sounded different, tired in a specific way that I recognized, the way a person sounds after they've been carrying something they shouldn't have been carrying. He said he'd seen some of the documents. He didn't say how. He said he didn't know that Dad had been planning it for that long. I said I didn't either. He said, I'm sorry, Mom. That was all. But it was enough for that phone call. The judge in our case was a woman in her late 50s who wore reading glasses on a beaded chain and had a reputation, Patricia told me, for not tolerating what she called financial gamesmanship in divorce proceedings. I never met her face to face. Most of it was handled through filings and a single mediation session that Gordon attended by phone because his health didn't allow him to travel. The mediation was a strange afternoon. I sat in a conference room in a building on Merrimon Avenue and listened to his voice through a speakerphone, and it was the first time I had heard him since the kitchen table conversation, and he sounded old. He sounded, honestly, diminished. Like someone who had spent 2 years planning something and had arrived at the execution of it and found that it had cost him more than he'd expected. His attorney made arguments. Patricia made arguments. The mediator asked questions. At one point, Gordon said something about wanting what was fair. I wrote the word fair on my notepad and looked at it for a long time. The LLC transfer was ruled a fraudulent conveyance. That's the legal term. It sounds dramatic, and I suppose it was. What it meant practically was that the transfer of the house into Ridgeline Property Holdings was set aside. The house returned to the marital estate. It was subject to equitable distribution, the standard in North Carolina, which doesn't mean 50-50, but means the court decides what's fair based on the contributions and circumstances of the marriage. I received 58% of the home's assessed value. I also received a portion of the investment account, not all of it, but enough. After Patricia demonstrated that our financial decisions during the marriage had directly enabled its growth. I remember driving home from Patricia's office the afternoon she told me the settlement had been finalized. I pulled over at a gas station on I-26 and sat in the parking lot for about 10 minutes. Not crying exactly, something else. The feeling of a door closing. Not slamming, just swinging shut with a soft final click. Gordon died 7 weeks after the settlement was signed. His heart, which had been struggling for 2 years, stopped during the night at his apartment. He had been renting a place in Biltmore Forest, nothing like the house. Something temporary. He had told Renata he intended to upgrade once things were sorted. Things were sorted now, I suppose, in a way none of us had anticipated. Miles called me at 6 in the morning. I was already awake. I am almost always awake at 6. He said, "Dad's gone." I said, "I know." I didn't mean that I had known it was coming specifically. I meant something harder to explain. That I had already been grieving something for a long time, and that this news landed in a place that was already worn smooth. I asked if there was anything I could do. He said he didn't think so. He said it quietly, without any of the edge that had been in his voice a year ago. I went to the service. I want to say that plainly too, because I know some people wouldn't have. Gloria came with me. She wore a gray blazer and held my hand during the part where they played the hymn Gordon had always said was his favorite, though I had never actually heard him mention it before the service program arrived. Renata spoke. She talked about her father the way you talk about someone complicated, with love that has edges, with stories chosen carefully. She looked at me once from the podium. I nodded. Joel stood next to me outside afterward. We didn't talk much. He put his arm around me for a moment, and I leaned against him, and we stood there in the November cold, looking at the parking lot. Miles shook my hand before I left. An actual handshake. I didn't know what to make of it, so I just held his hand for an extra second and let go. I sold the house in February. I had considered keeping it. For about 3 weeks, I genuinely considered it, walking through the rooms, looking at the garden, trying to decide if I could live inside the shape of the life we had built there without the person I had built it with. The answer, when it came, was not angry. It was just clear. I bought a smaller house in Weaverville, about 20 minutes north of Asheville. It has a front porch and a decent yard and a kitchen with better light than the old house, which had always bothered me more than I admitted. Gloria came to help me move. She brought her daughter, who was 26 and strong and has a truck, and the three of us moved boxes for 2 days and ate takeout on the floor and laughed more than I expected to. On the last day in the old house, I walked through each room one time. I wasn't looking for anything. I was just finishing something. In the back garden, before I left, I cut 2 stems from the roses along the fence, the ones that had taken me 8 years to get right, and wrapped them in a damp paper towel and put them in a plastic bag. I planted them the following spring along the back fence of the new yard. They're taking. It's slow, but they're taking. Renata called me in March. I was surprised, but not as surprised as I expected to be. She asked if we could have lunch sometime. She said she had been doing a lot of thinking. She said she was sorry that she'd sent the sympathy card and then gone quiet, that she hadn't known what to do and had handled it badly. I said I understood that. We had lunch in April at a place in downtown Asheville. We talked for 3 hours. We talked about her father the way you can only talk about someone once they're gone, without the pressure of needing to protect them or manage them or defend your position. We talked about her kids, my grandchildren, who I had been seeing less of because of everything. We talked about what we wanted things to look like going forward. She said she'd always thought of me as her real mother in most of the ways that mattered. I said I had always thought of her as my daughter in most of the ways that mattered. We didn't make any grand declarations. We just paid the check and hugged in the parking lot and said we'd do it again. I'm 69 years old now. I teach a creative writing class on Tuesday evenings at the community center in Weaverville, which I started doing 6 months ago because someone asked, and I said yes before I could talk myself out of it. I have 8 students. 3 of them are older than I am. The hip surgery happened last fall. Recovery was slower than I wanted and faster than the doctor expected. I walked without a limp by Christmas, which I considered a personal victory. The ring is in a small dish on my dresser. I took it off the month after the settlement. I was washing dishes and it slipped a little and I looked down at it and thought, not today. and also not anymore. I set it on the edge of the sink and then put it in the dish, and that was that. I don't look at it every day. Some mornings I do. I'm not sure yet what I'll do with it eventually. There's no hurry. What I know is this: 31 years of a life are not erased because the person you built them with turned out to be, in the end, someone who would plan quietly against you for 2 years while you covered the garden beds and scheduled the dentist appointments and thought you were building toward something shared. Those years happened. I happened in them. The roses are proof, if proof is something you need. I don't particularly need proof anymore, but I kept them anyway. I've thought a lot about what it means to trust someone completely, and what happens to you when that trust turns out to have been, at least in part, a one-way arrangement. I don't say that with bitterness. I've worked hard not to let this become a bitter story, because bitterness is just grief that hasn't figured out where to go yet, and I've had enough time now to point my grief somewhere more useful. What I keep coming back to is this: Gordon was, in many ways, a careful man. He planned things. He documented things. He prepared for outcomes most people don't want to think about. And somewhere along the way, that carefulness turned inward and became something else. A quiet strategy built on the assumption that I wouldn't look closely, wouldn't push back, wouldn't know how. He underestimated me. Not out of cruelty, I think, out of habit. When you've watched someone trust you completely for 31 years, you can start to mistake their trust for incapacity. Those are not the same thing. I trusted Gordon because I chose to. I managed our household, raised our children, supported his career, held our social life together, and handled every logistical and emotional detail of our shared existence. Because that was the agreement we had made, not in writing, but in the daily accumulation of a life. My trust was not weakness. It was a decision I made every single day, and the fact that he eventually moved against it doesn't make it the wrong decision. It makes it a decision that he failed to honor. That's an important distinction. I needed a long time to find it. What I know about getting through something hard, real hard, the kind that reorganizes who you are, is that it requires two things that nobody tells you go together: clarity and patience, not one or the other, both. You need the clarity to see what actually happened, stripped of the story you'd been telling yourself, and you need the patience to let the process work, to sit in the discomfort of not knowing how it ends, to do the next right thing even when the outcome isn't guaranteed. Patricia Walsh showed me what clarity looked like professionally. Gloria showed me what it looked like personally, just asking the right question at the right moment. When did he form that LLC? 4 words that changed everything. You need people in your life who are not afraid to ask the uncomfortable question out loud. Hold on to those people. Miles and Joel came back in their own time and in their own ways. I didn't force it. I didn't make them choose again or punish them for having chosen wrong the first time. People make decisions based on what they know and what they fear, and sometimes they need to see more before they can see clearly. That's not an excuse. It's just what I observed, and responding to it with patience rather than a closing door turned out to matter. Renata and I have lunch now. That still surprises me some mornings. The roses are growing along the back fence in Weaverville. Slowly, but they're going. That's what I'd want anyone to take from this. If they're sitting somewhere right now feeling like the life they built has been pulled out from under them, what you built is still real. Your years are still yours. The knowledge you earned, the relationships you tended, the strength you didn't know you had until you had to use it. None of that transfers into an LLC. None of that can be filed away in a courthouse. You showed up. For decades, you showed up. For decades, you showed up. That counts. It counted then and it counts now, regardless of how anyone else chose to treat it. The next right thing is usually smaller than you expect. An attorney's name from a friend, a phone call to your sister, a question written on a notepad. Start there.